Hello and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm Robin Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth experts who are sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. This is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. If you're on social media or follow the news, there's been a lot of talk about radioactive wastewater being released from Japan's Fukushima power plant. You might remember Fukushima after it had to close down 3 reactors following a tsunami in 2011 to avoid an even greater nuclear accident. In this episode, we'll explore the real risks of radiation and how, unsurprisingly, what spreads on the internet isn't always based on fact. New. I'm joined by Professor Jim Smith from the University of Portsmouth, and together we're going to explore the realities of this internet-led panic, what we can do to understand the nuclear industry better, and how we often focus on the wrong risks in life. So, Jim, you've been on Life Solved previously. This is before my time.
Quite a long time ago, yeah.
Quite a long time ago. And what was it in particular that you were talking about in that episode?
I was talking about my work on the Chernobyl accident. So I've studied Chernobyl since 1990 when I was a PhD student studying the radioactivity that arrived in the UK from Chernobyl. So we were studying where the radioactivity went once it had fallen on the land and how it transferred through the land and into lakes and rivers and then eventually into the sea. So we were studying where it went in the environment.
So we're going to give a bit of a brief history lesson for Chernobyl anyway, because it's all related to radiation. But if you do want to listen to that episode, you can find it in the link in our description below. And definitely worth checking out after this episode. So we're going to talk a little bit more detail about Fukushima nuclear plant. But let's start with the bigger conversation around the basics. So what is radiation? How can you summarise that to people that maybe don't understand it very well?
So that's a really difficult question. Radiation is something that comes out of nuclear power plants, or the sun produces lots of radiation because the sun is a giant nuclear fusion reactor, as well as lots of elements that are in the Earth's crust produce radiation. So radiation is what comes out when radioactive elements undergo radioactive decay. In other words, something like uranium has been around in the solar system ever since it started. But every now and again, a uranium atom will go pop and it'll give out a radioactive alpha particle or beta particle or a gamma ray. And so there's lots of radiation in our environment around us, coming from the sun, coming from the soil, but also there's what we call artificial radiation, which is radiation that's produced in nuclear reactors and can get into the environment.
So I imagine there's a bit of confusion around the radiation that we've had forever, since the dawn of time, and then artificial radiation, which we'll be talking about as well in this episode. And do people often confuse the two and freak out when they hear radiation and kind of bundle it all together?
Well, people tend to be a lot more relaxed about natural radiation than they are about artificial, because natural, we associate it with natural things, which we generally tend to think are quite good for us. Artificial, we associate with terrible things like the Chernobyl accident, like the Fukushima accident, like the terrible atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we associate human-made radioactivity with all these terrible things. We're not quite as worried about natural radiation, even though the levels in the environment of natural radiation tend to be almost everywhere much, much higher than artificial.
So in terms of natural radiation, how much natural radiation, can you put it into sort of a amount, do we get exposed to on a day-to-day basis?
So we get exposed to natural radiation from the cosmos, so from the solar wind, so particles coming from the sun and particles coming from the centre of the Milky Way and all around us. And we tend to get exposed to more of that when we're at high altitude. So people who live at high altitudes get higher natural radiation doses than we do in Portsmouth next to the sea. We also get exposed to radiation from the soil, so the earth, the building materials of our houses, gives us an exposure to natural radiation, and that varies a lot depending on where you live. So if you live in Cornwall, for example, you could get 5 times what we get here in Portsmouth of natural radiation. And so to give you an idea of what that, so we measure radiation amounts in a thing called a microsievert. So a microsievert is a dose of radiation. So when I go to Chernobyl and do field work, I take a badge which tells me how many microsieverts of radiation I've got while I've been there. And it's usually very low and much lower than the natural radiation dose I get. So for example, in Portsmouth, we get about 2,400 microsieverts of natural radiation every year from the air around us and the cosmic rays and things like that. Many people in Cornwall could get 5,000 or even 10,000 microsieverts, depending on where they live, because the rocks are different and they have different amounts of natural radiation in the rocks. An airline air crew could get 2,000 or 3,000 microsieverts extra because they're at high altitude for a long time, so they're not protected by the Earth's atmosphere from all the cosmic rays. So natural radiation doses can vary depending on your job and where you live.
It's all relative. And I imagine, like, when you say it's a couple of thousand more, in my head, I'm immediately thinking, God, that's a lot. But it's about
all
normal.
Even 10,000 is quite a low dose. That's about the limit. So if you're living in Cornwall and you get more than 10,000 because of the construction of your house where it is, then measures have to be put in place to reduce the radioactivity and reduce your radiation dose.
So 10,000's about the max that we're sort of aiming for. So when you're going to a place like Chernobyl, is that what you're looking out for on your badge? Hopefully it doesn't go anything
more
over
or less.
10.
Well, I tend to... The aim for members of the public is not to get more than 1,000 extra above the natural radiation dose. So that's what, after the Chernobyl accident, areas were evacuated more or less on that basis of getting not more than 1,000 to 5,000 microsieverts extra above the natural background. When I go to Chernobyl for 2 weeks and do field work, I get about 100 extra microsieverts, and so I think that's fine. It's still, in theory, it still gives me a risk of getting cancer in later life, but for me that risk is very, very low and much less than if I went for a few months to Cornwall, and so I think it's acceptable.
That's fascinating that if you went to Cornwall, you're more likely to get exposed to more radiation than if you went to Chernobyl for 2 weeks. And to me, that's fascinating, because whenever I think of Chernobyl, I automatically think, don't go there because you'll be exposed to high levels of radiation. But from what you've just said, that's not necessarily the case.
It's not necessarily the case, because it's always more complicated than that, because there are hot spots in Chernobyl. So, for example, the whole exclusion zone at Chernobyl is about 4,000 square kilometres. So it's quite a big area of land. It's bigger than Hampshire. But only a small proportion of that you would say, well, I really wouldn't go there for too long, or I really wouldn't want to live there. There are hot spots where there was more deposition of radioactivity after there was an explosion, then a fire that lasted for 10 days. And depending on where the wind was blowing and the weather conditions, some areas got quite significant radioactivity. So there's an area called the Red Forest, and it's called the Red Forest because it died after the accident, or most of the trees died from the intense radiation that was in it. And so and that's about 6 square kilometres. So it's a tiny fraction of the whole area of the zone. But there we wear a badge, we make sure we're not there for too many hours. I wouldn't live there because the radiation it's 100 times less than what it was immediately after the accident, but it's still very radioactive. But there are other areas of the exclusion zone where people can and do live quite happily. So we've got colleagues who work in Chernobyl, and they live for 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off in the town of Chernobyl, which is 10 kilometres south of the reactor. And they're living, going about their daily business. There's also old people, and it tends to be old people who stayed, and they said, we're staying in our homes, and they're fine. And when you look at the radiation doses that they're getting, they're not living in the most contaminated part of the zone. They're getting about 2,000 to 3,000 microsieverts of dose extra, which is within what we expect from natural radiation. And so I would say that those people who've made that decision to stay, if that's what they want to do with their lives, and that's probably for them, that's the best psychologically, socially, in terms of their health, it's probably the best decision.
Well, it's their home, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And for you personally, obviously you do a lot of work there and you have been there for certain amounts of time. What was the maximum amount of radiation that you personally were exposed to there?
Well, I've been in areas that are up to about 200 microsieverts every hour. And that's one of the areas where I wouldn't stay for, if I go for more than a few hours, then I have to get classified as a radiation worker and all that instead of a scientist. And so there are areas that are hotspots there still, and that's 30 years on. But most of the areas we go to, I wouldn't say are really dangerously radioactive.
And what do you have to do in order to prepare to go into those particularly radioactive areas? Is there suits that you have to wear, or do you have to, I know you mentioned about the timing, making sure you don't stay there over a certain amount of time.
I used to wear a suit, but it was more for, it didn't actually reduce my radiation dose very much because if you're not eating the mushrooms, or the mushrooms there are very contaminated, in the forest. So if you're not eating the mushrooms and the fish and some of the berries and things, then your radiation dose is mainly what we call external. So it's coming from the soil around you, and it's these gamma rays. And the gamma rays just go straight through your radiation suit because you need lots of lead or lots of concrete to stop gamma rays. And so, in theory, you should. And we tended to do it because we put it on our risk assessment that we would. But actually, it doesn't make any difference to our radiation dose. And now I don't, because I want to sort of make the point that it's the risks. We know what the risks are; they're controllable, and you don't need to wear a suit to do that. In some situations, yes, you do, but in that situation, you don't. I've swum in the cooling pond at Chernobyl, so the lake or the reservoir that held the cooling water for the reactors, and I knew what the dose was, and I knew it was insignificant, and I sort of did it just to sort of prove, that's fine. Whereas I wouldn't go camping in the Red Forest. Some people do. Some unofficially, some Ukrainians used to go and just say, "I'm a big tough man. I will go and camp in the Red Forest, the most contaminated area." But I wouldn't do that because it's a significant dose and it's not necessary.
And it's important to note there as well that radiation, it doesn't stay the same amount. Over time, it does decrease.
It decreases, yeah. So if we compare the amount of radioactivity in the environment now from Chernobyl compared to what it was immediately after the accident, it's gone down by about 100 times. And that's because a lot of the radioactive elements that were emitted were what we call short-lived. So they decay out of the environment very, very quickly. But what remains is longer-lived elements like radioactive cesium, radioactive strontium, plutonium. They can stay in the environment for long periods of time.
So if I were to say, move into the Red Forest and make it my next home and begin, farming on the land, if there is anything to farm, not really moving away from that area, what risks could I see, or what side effects could I potentially see from that exposure to radiation?
Well, you would have an elevated risk of getting cancer in later life. So if we have what we call an acute exposure to very high doses of radiation, and they're the sort of exposures that you get in cancer treatment, and the sort of doses that people got after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs, or some people got after the Chernobyl accident itself. So then you would definitely get ill, and you could die within a few weeks. In the Red Forest, the doses are in the region of sort of environmental doses. And you would have an elevated risk of getting cancer in later life. And because of the high doses that are there in that small area, it would be a very significantly elevated. And we would say that it's not acceptable. Other parts of the exclusion zone, the doses are much, much, much lower. And we would say, well, that's an acceptable risk.
I think I'll stick to the South Coast for the time being.
The other thing we've looked at is the animals in the zone. Because, of course, humans were evacuated from this huge area, but the animals stayed. What we found, we worked with so the zone is half in Ukraine and half in Belarus. And we worked for a long time with our colleagues in Belarus who were doing surveys of mammals, large mammals in the zone, so red deer, wolf, wild boar, and so on. And so they would go out, if there was a fresh snowfall, they would go out and on certain designated routes and count the number of animal tracks on those routes and identify the species. And what we did was we took their 35 different routes of about 10 kilometres length each, and we took them and we reconstructed the radiation dose on each route. And what we wanted to find out was, is the abundance and diversity of mammals different in the more contaminated areas compared to the less contaminated areas? And we didn't find a difference. And then we compared the mammals in the Chernobyl zone with mammals in other nature reserves in Belarus, and we didn't find a difference. The only difference we found was that the wolf population at Chernobyl is 7 times higher than in other nature reserves in Belarus. And that's not because the radiation's good for the wolves, but because the human interference is less. And so the lesson from Chernobyl, it's had a huge impact on people, not least from the evacuations and the worry and the economic damage. But the natural environment is more abundant and diverse now than it was before the exact accident, because people have moved out and we're no longer fishing, we're no longer farming, we're no longer hunting, doing forestry. All those things have given the natural ecosystem a chance to not only recover from the accident, but to be better than it was before we left.
So it's humanity that's more of an issue than radiation itself, apparently, there.
Yes.
Some really big questions, isn't there, to answer for that? And I take it then no 4-headed deers or anything like that?
We haven't seen any.
What a shame. So that's Chernobyl. Obviously, it's a really well-known one. And something else that's been hitting headlines recently, another nuclear plant, is Fukushima. Can you just explain to our listeners, maybe they haven't seen it in the news, why has Fukushima been hitting headlines?
So the Fukushima site in 2011 had a terrible meltdown at 3 of its reactors when the tsunami, so there was an earthquake and a tsunami which overwhelmed the sea defences of the site, and that led to what we call a loss of coolant accident. So the reactors didn't have the power anymore to cool themselves because the emergency diesel generators were overwhelmed by the tsunami. And so 3 of the reactors exploded, and it wasn't as
It's all right, takes it. Beauty of pre-record.
Yeah. So the Fukushima accident wasn't as severe as Chernobyl, but it led to a large area of land being evacuated and contamination of the marine ecosystem because the Fukushima was on the coast. So Fukushima's been in the news recently because it's been storing, since about 2012, all the radioactive wastewater that's generated on the site. So that's water that's been used to cool the reactors and water that's been pumped from groundwater, which became contaminated after the accident. So all that's been stored on site in about 1,000 giant tanks, all of them containing 1.3 million cubic metres of radioactive wastewater. And now that water's been treated, so it's been treated to remove almost all of the radioactive elements, but what's left is being discharged into the Pacific Ocean. And that's because the Japanese say they can't keep on accumulating and building more and more tanks, so they've taken the decision in August to start discharging that into the Pacific Ocean.
There was a fair bit of uproar around this decision, not just, I suppose, from the general public, but also other governments. What were their main issues with the decision to release the wastewater?
So there was a feeling, and it sounds scary, 1.3 million cubic metres of radioactive wastewater going into the ocean. It sounds terrifying, and so a lot of people interpreted this as being a really dangerous thing, and it could lead to risk of, if you consume seafood products from Japan, there could be a risk, or if the release of the water could damage the marine ecosystem of the Pacific. So those were the claims. But in fact, the truth is a lot more reassuring than that, I think. So what's left in the water, so the Japanese have a very efficient water treatment process that takes out almost all the radioactivity except an element called tritium. And tritium is a radioactive form of hydrogen. So what happens in nuclear reactors all over the world is that a tiny proportion of the water that flows through the reactor gets turned into what we call tritiated water. In other words, instead of being H2O, one of the hydrogens gets replaced by this radioactive form of hydrogen, tritium, and it becomes HTO, tritiated water. And the problem that everybody has with tritiated water is that it can't be chemically separated from ordinary water because it behaves exactly the same. It is water, it's just got a different form of hydrogen atom in. And so what nuclear sites all over the world do is to release that into a river or lake or into the sea. And that's what the Japanese government decided to do at Fukushima, and it's no different than anyone else does, except that because it's Fukushima, there was a whole uproar about it and claims of major risk to the Pacific and major risk to seafood consumers, which weren't at all founded in science.
You said there because it's Fukushima, that's why there was a big uproar. This is something that's already happening across the world at other plants, and we'll get to that in a moment. But why were people so fascinated with the decision at Fukushima? What was it about that particular plant?
Well, I think because if this had been any other site in the world, it wouldn't have got any media attention, I don't think, because it's kind of normal activity. It happens in nuclear sites in the UK, in the US, in France, everywhere, in China, in South Korea. But I think people associate anything that happens there with the, terrible and undoubtedly terrible aftermath of the accident at Fukushima, and we tend to conflate those two things in our minds. But what this new nuclear release has nothing to do with that original release during the accident. And I think there's been an element of people kind of taking advantage of that, people who maybe aren't pro-Japan, shall we say, that some countries have said, well, they're using that as a reason to attack Japan, whereas scientifically it has no basis, I think.
So you mentioned there about the process that Japan's taken in order to treat this radioactive water before releasing it. What exactly is that process? Because people will say that, and I have seen articles where they've said, oh, they're hiding things or they're not being 100% transparent. But You'd argue they have been 100% transparent with this.
I think they've been very transparent, and more transparent than most nuclear sites around the world are about their releases, though it's got a lot better in recent decades, especially in Europe and the US, about disclosure of what's going on at these sites. So the water gets treated by a thing called ion exchange. So it goes through a series of it gets filtered, and then it goes through a series of giant columns that have substances in that will chemically react with the radioactive isotopes in the water, and so that the isotopes then get attached to the solid phase of these tanks, and then the water it doesn't pass through. So that then, once that absorber is kind of used up, it then needs to be buried as radioactive waste, but the water coming out of it is almost free of radioactivity, apart from this thing called tritiated water. And so that the amounts of other things that are in the water, there are still tiny amounts of other things in the water, but once the water's gone through that treatment, and then when it goes out the pipeline, it's diluted 100 times, so that the tritium levels will be 2.5% of the Japanese limit for discharge, and the other radionuclides levels will be less than 1% of the limit. And those limits are already quite cautious in terms of the radiation doses that people get from eating seafood and so on. And so when the water goes out the pipeline, the tritium levels are 7 times lower than the World Health Organization drinking water limit for tritium. So in theory, if it wasn't salty, you could drink this water when it comes out the pipeline.
So Japanese officials have been transparent. They are doing a process that's 7 times lower than the recommended amount by the World Health Organization.
For drinking.
And, you're saying you're confident in this process, and yet the headlines are still circulating now, several months after the first wastewater release, about the impact to marine life and as a result to humans who ingest that, to biodiversity, all this stuff. I mean, I think there was a thing about it could contaminate the whole Pacific Ocean within 57 days or something like that. One of the headlines or one of the...
Well, it's just ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. Of course, we know that when water goes into the ocean, then it's going to go all over the place. It's going to go all over the world. But what matters is how much there is. And just to give you an idea of that, so that the Japanese have now done one of the releases of wastewater, and they've done monitoring. And that monitoring is checked by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it can be checked by anybody, because anybody can go and get some water from around there. It's not like you can hide it very easily. And so the Japanese results are there on the website, and they've measured 251 samples of water within 3 kilometres of the pipeline, and only one of them came above the detection limit. And that detection limit is quite low. And so really, after that first release, of course there's tritium there because it's gone in. We know it's gone in, but it's even very hard to find, even within 3 kilometres of the pipeline, let alone across 1,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. And the fish have been sampled as well, and no tritium's been found in the fish. Although some of it will get in, but it's really, really low. And it's much lower than what's already in the fish from other natural radioactive elements in the fish.
Didn't the Japanese, was it president, he had some sushi from Fukushima?
Yes, he did. I mean, it's always dangerous when politicians do that, because people tend not to be very convinced by it. But he did, and I would eat fish from that area quite happily.
So there's evidence to back it. They've done reviews of the wastewater release after the fact. They've got experts like yourself saying it's all safe and it's being done in a very effective way. And yet, there's still so many myths and misconceptions circulating. Why do you think that is? Despite there being evidence, despite journalists having access to this knowledge, why are these things still going out on social media and in news outlets?
I think there's been a lot of good coverage, and there's lots of great science journalists who want to get the story right. And in general, in my opinion, they've got it right, more or less. But there's also lots of news journalists who don't know the science, and they just see the headlines and they see claims by various people that this is a big risk. And for example, China has claimed that this is a huge risk to the Pacific Ocean, when we know, so Fukushima is planning to release 22 trillion so we measure radioactivity in becquerels, the amount of it. So Fukushima is planning to release 22 trillion becquerels of tritiated water every year. And it sounds like a lot, but there's a nuclear site in China that releases 180 trillion becquerels every year. There's a nuclear site in France that does reprocessing in Le Hague that releases 10,000 trillion becquerels of tritium into the English Channel. And we've measured the fish, the French have measured the fish and the radiation doses, and they're still incredibly low. So what really matters is not, we can't say there's zero risk, but that risk is so insignificant that it's nothing to worry about. And certainly when you put it in the context of real environmental problems in the Pacific, so the Pacific's under threat, no doubt, from climate change, from sewage inputs from all countries in the Pacific, from overfishing, from plastic pollution. When you put this Fukushima release in the context of those, it just doesn't register. And it's a distraction. We need to be, if we're going to protect our environment, we need to focus on the real environmental problems and not the ones that we imagine.
So I suppose the kind of key takeaway as a consumer of news is to, rather than just read one article or see one headline or one social media clip alluding to something when it comes to a topic that's arguably quite serious, radiation is a serious thing, to do a bit of research, find a couple of news sources.
And it's hard because there's so much stuff out there. But what I always say to people is, who's got the evidence? It's very easy. Anybody can say, oh, that's dangerous. We know radiation does DNA damage. Anyone can say, oh, that's dangerous because it does DNA damage. But where's the evidence? How is that quantified? There's decades and decades of research which quantifies that risk. And we have evidence, and we try as scientists to put that evidence in front of people so that they can see see what that risk is. If the evidence is there, then people are convinced, but very often people make claims without providing the evidence.
We take risks in everything we do day to day. Getting in a car, there's risks. You said flying. When we get in a plane, there's risks. So as with anything, you just have to assess the risks and make an informed decision.
Yeah, and people actually are very good at that. People, when they have the information, we all get used to making decisions, and difficult decisions. Parents, we make decisions about our children and what we think is a risk for them and what's safe for them. People are good at it, but if they don't have the information, if they're getting the wrong information, it's very difficult to make a judgment.
And we said about eating fish from Fukushima, Japan, but you've actually taken it. You kind of did that first. You beat the Japanese government to it and started producing a drink from Chernobyl just to prove that it's okay to ingest things from radioactive sites. Yeah.
So the idea about we've produced a schnapps from Chernobyl made from apples that are grown in the contaminated areas at Chernobyl, and we spent quite a lot of time working with a community in a town called Narodiche, which is in what we call the second zone. So it's not abandoned, but there's no official use of agricultural land there. So there's a school and a council and shops and things, but there's no investment officially allowed, and there's no official use of agricultural land. And so we've been doing a project to say this land can be used again. And as part of that, we studied the transfer of radioactivity into crops 35 years after the Chernobyl accident, and we found that the crops were still slightly contaminated. They weren't super dangerous, but they were still slightly contaminated. And then when we distilled, we did rye and we did apples, and we distilled them, we couldn't find any radioactivity in the distillate in the product that we'd made. And so we set up a social enterprise called the Chernobyl Spirit Company to produce and sell a kind of apple schnapps, or we call it an eau de vie because it sounds posher.
Sounds nice and French,
so it's a bit like a vodka, but it's still got the flavour. It's not distilled to such a high level as vodka, so it's still got the flavour of the apples. And we're selling that in the UK, and the profits we're making are going to support the community in Narodiche.
And the name of that?
Atomic.
Well, it's great. I've actually had some. I came to the Pint of Science presentation, and I have to admit it was very nice. And the fact that it's slightly radioactive does give it a bit of a kick.
Well, it's not. That's
but it's thing. Not. But in your head,
it is in our minds. It is in our minds. But we've got very good colleagues at Southampton University who are experts in measuring this stuff and have all the kit. And they couldn't find any.
There you go.
We've sent them to...
Don't tell people that, because that's the unique selling point.
We've sent some to the States to a lab that claims it's got one of the best gamma radiation detectors in the world, and they're going to see if they can find any. We'll see.
Fingers crossed a little bit, because alcohol, it's risky business anyway. Why not chuck some more on it?
There is radioactivity in it, but there's natural carbon-14, which is in everything. Everything you buy at a supermarket, including our bodies, have got natural carbon-14 in. So.
And how much money have you raised so far through it?
We've given away about 30,000 quid to Ukraine.
That's amazing, and obviously at a time when any money helps.
Yeah.
So obviously Christmas is coming up. If anyone wants to purchase Atomic,
www.atomicvodka.com.
Perfect. I know what I'm getting my family for Christmas. So thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been really fascinating, and I think it all comes down to calculated risk, looking at the risks associated with radiation, because we're not saying there aren't risks, obviously there are, but it's comparing those, measuring those against other risks that you might come to, and making an informed decision that actually it's not as bad as we think. So if you'd like to listen to the full episode of This Life Solved, then please head to the University of Portsmouth website or download it on your favourite podcast app now. You can also click the link in the comments box below, or head to ports.ac.uk/research to find out more about the university's School of Environment, Geography and Geosciences, where Jim is based. Next time, we look at the world of protest, how effective it is, what powers do protesters have, and how might those rights be affected in the future. See you then.